A Fifth Circuit panel strikes down the domestic violence restraining order gun prohibition. Plus, Monster Hunter International author Larry Correia on his new book defending the Second Amendment. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
Oh, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free weekly newsletter if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America. You can also buy a membership if you want to get even more insight into the issue and have access to hundreds of exclusive pieces of content that you won't find anywhere else, and get this podcast a day early, as well as the opportunity to appear on the show in a member segment. This week, we're doing something a little bit different. We have a well-known best-selling author on with us to talk about his latest book. We have author Larry Correia of the Monster Hunter series, who's now written a Second Amendment book in defense of the Second Amendment. Welcome to the show, Larry. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Stephen. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, can you just tell people a little bit more about yourself and your history before we get going?
Yeah, I actually have kind of an interesting background. I came up. I'm pretty famous as a writer, as a novelist, writing science fiction and fantasy novels. I've got a bunch of different series, 25 books I've written now, all over the world, various languages. Really popular, won awards. I'm a New York Times bestseller.
Yep.
Or it used to be. They take that away from me now if they could. Now that they know who I am. But I'm a pretty popular fiction writer. However, before that, I was actually in the gun business. I was a gun store owner. I was an SOT, so I did machine guns, suppressors, that kind of thing. I was a firearms instructor. I did a lot of different things on that. I was a concealed weapons instructor for many years in the state of Utah. Very busy. I did that. I certified thousands of people to carry guns in Utah. I am a former competition guy. I used to shoot a lot of three gun. Three gun was my primary sport, but I dabbled in, I did a lot of IDPA too, but I did a little USPSA and that kind of thing. And I played with everything, and I was okay, but I'm a huge gun nut. Now that I'm a full-time writer, I've been doing this for 12 years. I was approached by Regnery, a nonfiction publisher, because they wanted to do a definitive guide to the Second Amendment. And kind of like, well, I say definitive guide, not like a historical one, but more like a handy dandy Bible for people who are debating this subject. They wanted to have a book that was like arm people with good facts, good arguments, a book that you could give to fence sitters, help them along, and give you guys the good arguments, give you guys lots of stats and cites, and explain the laws and how this stuff works. And they needed someone who was a good writer first and a hardcore gun guy second. And they knew me from editing some of my other books of fiction. And they said, hey, we got the perfect guy. He eats, sleeps, lives, and breathes guns. That's what he does. And they asked me to write this book, and it came out fantastic. I'm really proud of it. Came out last week. It was released. It's doing extremely well. The numbers on the pre-order were fantastic. So I'm very excited, and it seems from what people are saying, they're really liking it. It's helping them out. So I'm just hoping this book will help move the needle on the debate a little bit. It's a subject I've been really passionate about for my whole life, and so getting a chance to put my skill sets as a writer to helping defend the Second Amendment, then I just hope this helps the debate.
Yeah, and I read the book in the lead up to this interview here. I also listened to Monster Hunter International, which is your very first published work and one of your most famous, right? Frankly, I enjoyed both of them quite a lot. And I think that the history you just described there really does come through in both books. Your experience with firearms is clear, right? I'm a certified instructor as well. I've done a very small amount of competitive shooting. I own a lot of guns. I like to build ARs and so forth.
Oh yeah.
Similar background to you. I was never a dealer though, so you definitely have a hand up on that. And
it's
and
not
I think
fun.
That yes, I never had to deal. I only have to deal with the press people at the ATF. So yeah. I don't envy you guys having to deal with the compliance people. Especially with what's going on recently. We just talked about on the last episode of the podcast with Bearing Arms Cam Edwards. But But yeah, like I think that knowledge really does come through in both of these aspects of your writing career, and I think it really improves both books because there's a lot of fiction books that deal with firearms and movies and TV, and anyone who knows about guns and has experience with guns knows that 99% of them are laughably bad when it comes to the gunplay and to what happens with shootouts and so forth. And even though your books are about hunting monsters, literally, the gunplay is extremely realistic in it. And the way you talk about firearms, the way you talk about shooting, the way you talk about training, all of that experience that you have really does come through in those books. And I would say for this new book, which is nonfiction, of course, it comes through there as well. You're very knowledgeable. You're very up to date as well, I would say, on what's going on with gun politics in America. And, I read this book and I think there's like two people that I could really see this book being for, right? The first one is, as you described there, like somebody who is into guns, perhaps knows the political noise around them, but wants to be a bit more knowledgeable on the debate and the details of it and the sort of the best pro-gun arguments that are out there. That's certainly contained in this book. I think somebody who's a gun owner who wants to get a little more up to speed on the political debate is going to get a lot out of this book, and is probably going to really agree with it. Because the perspective comes through too, right? As a pro-gun person who's been doing this for decades,
long time.
At this point, obviously your perspective is shines through in a lot of this. And, the second person I think that it's for is somebody who wants to understand that. Maybe they don't agree. Maybe they're on the other side, but they want to understand as best as possible the arguments that pro-gun people really believe in. And that's where, I would recommend a book like this to somebody like that. If they can get through like the pro-gun perspective, It reminds me a lot of Kevin Williamson. He's a writer was for National Review. I think he's at the Dispatch now. He's written prolifically. He's out there. He writes about guns from time to time, and he can be very sardonic and like he's very secure in his point of view. Right, just as you are in your writing, very passionate about it, and there's nothing wrong with that, right?
Well, I think on that note, it's actually I write comedy novels too. I actually have a comedy series, and so I put a lot of comedy into like my regular books. So for me, writing a nonfiction book, it would be impossible for me to write a book that was like 100% academic, straight down the line, serious. I even said that,
and it probably wouldn't be as interesting to read either, to be frank.
Yeah. I was trying to do something that could be entertaining for people too, because honestly, like people who are already on our side, they're going to love the book, and so my reviews are showing that. People who believe in guns, they're like, yeah, this is how I feel. This says what I want to say. This speaks for me, and that's cool. But now getting out to regular people who are just kind of like on the fence, part of the thing is I wanted to kind of use my writer skills, I guess, to hook them and to kind of tell the story of the Second Amendment in the U.S. and how it works. And when I get into current events, I don't hold anything back. I don't go cold and analytical. I go in there, swinging. I tell people, this is how it is. This is how it is logically. This is how it is emotionally. This is how we react to this stuff. And I use tons of examples, real life examples. I cite everything. I've got 13 pages of small print cites for every incident I talk about is in this book.
It's very true.
But I just wanted to write it in ways that people understand. It's like I opened the book actually talking about like the visceral aftermath on the news when we see some horrible thing happen on the news. And then I talk about kind of like the worst people who use that to their advantage to twist people's emotions and to try to push for more gun control, regardless of what actually happened. Facts be damned. And that's what I open with. And it's kind of raw, it's honest. But then I get into the book. I try to talk about every single argument they throw at us, every point that I could think of, going back for 30 years.
It's very comprehensive in that regard. It absolutely is. There's the whole section on do somethings, right? People always say after a mass shooting, you need to do something, and so you do go through effectively every significant suggestion there is, from the more from the lighter policies all the way through to full-on gun confiscation. And you explain, I think, in pretty plain terms with a lot of sourcing, why that's not a good idea, why each of these policies won't do what they intend, or they're half measures, or that will have less of an effect on the people they actually want to affect and more of an effect on law-abiding gun owners. And so it's extremely thorough in that regard. And I would say, to the Kevin Williamson comparison, he wrote a piece a while back where he essentially edited a news report that was about firearms, and it was poorly done report. And so he went through, and he was not kind about it, right? He was very straightforward, and made all of the remarks that he would have made if he was editing the piece itself. And it's something that probably would have turned off some of the people, like people who wrote the actual news story or edited it before it was published, probably wouldn't like that piece. But if they could get through the part where he's frankly righteously indignatious about how many mistakes there are, there's so much to actually learn from that, because it's not, and this is where I see the parallel to your book, because you're not throwing out a bunch of straw man arguments. You're not throwing out it's the Second Amendment, it's my right, I don't care about what you're saying. You actually go through and engage with these arguments and give the countervailing view, give the reasons why you don't think that they make sense and don't work. And it's something that you're not shy about it. People who agree with you are going to really like this book, but I think people who don't agree with you will get value out of it as well if they can get pick it up and read it.
I've actually found it's really interesting because I divide the anti-gun camp into basically two groups in the book, just for simplicity's sake. I know people are far more complicated than just that, but when you think about it, there's regular people who want to do something to stop violent crime. They want to stop murders. They want to stop killings, and they've been told that if we just control guns, we can do that. They've been given this promise their whole life. They've been told that ban guns, shootings won't happen anymore. Take handguns off the streets, criminals won't shoot people. Take away assault weapons, and there won't be mass shootings anymore. So on and so forth. Whatever it is. But they've been sold this bill of goods their whole life. And that's one group that I can reach, because I can say, okay, look, this is what you believe, and this is why you believe it, and I get that. However, let's go into what actually happens. Let's go into the reality. Let's go into the logic. Let's go into the logistics. Let's go into the history. Let's look at other states that have done it. Let's look at other countries that have done it, and this is what actually happens. So that first group, I have hope for, and I have over the years. I have actually had people change their mind on the gun debate because they got better information, or reality smacked them in the face, and all of a sudden they're like, wow, okay, I do need self-defense. But then there's the other group, the smaller group that I don't have any hopes of converting, and that's the ones that in the book I talk about the vultures. I talk about the vulture chapter, and I use vultures because that's the nicest term that the lawyers would let me use. But I say vultures because they're perched and they're waiting for carnage. They're waiting for death. And as soon as there's blood, they swoop right in and they are on it. And it doesn't matter what actually happened. It doesn't matter the reality of the case. It doesn't matter the facts of the case. They will argue immediately while emotions are high to get whatever they want. And I go into that a lot. And that's the part really where honestly I think no matter how good of a writer I am, my personal disdain is going to come through.
Well, I'm sure you're not the only person who feels that way about. That's what I mean. Like people who agree with you and who've noticed that sort of activist that exists out there. They're going to enjoy reading that chapter because honestly, you're putting into words the way they feel about this certain section of sort of people who operate in bad faith.
Yeah. Well, because the first group of honest people who just are don't know any better, they actually read stuff like that, and it puts it for the first time in their lives. You're like, oh wow, so this. I'm now in the gun guy's shoes. I'm now looking at it from the perspective of this guy and how they feel about this and what they want to do. And it's one way to actually reach that first group is you hook them and you say, okay, look, this is, because a lot of times, too often we have this argument, and it's like you're fighting, and we always try to go facts, academic, cold, hard stats versus emotion, and we're just beating them over the head. But that's not how human brains work. And so if you have a person who's wired emotionally, you're not going to sway them with that. So that's why I come at this kind of as a narrative kind of thing. Is like, look, this is. So here's the thing, because logically we win. Emotionally they win, but it doesn't have to be that way, because there's some fundamental basic truths that resonate with people that we have on our side, and that's self-defense is a human right, and the state can't come and save you, and this is emotional stuff. And so it's one thing is I'm trying to get that out there and try to, like I said, hopefully sway some people, or hopefully, I have friends that, like, I use an example, a good friend of mine, he wants to have a gun in the house for home defense, and his wife won't let him. I mean, we've all heard that story before, right? And so I'm writing a book for guys like that. Read this, give this to your wife, and hopefully, make a dent in that. But I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the big cores of the overarching argument in the book, right? Is this idea that guns are, you go through all of the sort of smaller step policies, and you talk about the pros and cons of those and why you don't think they'll work, like universal background checks, or you talk about the gun show loophole. You talk basically everything, assault weapons bans, everything that people bring up. You have a section on in this book. It really is pretty comprehensive, but I feel like it builds towards this basic idea of, all right, well, down the line to the very end of this, if you go all the way down this slippery slope, right, we're getting to a point of guns are inherently bad. Just their existence is bad, and ultimately people want to try to just remove their existence as sort of the end goal for some activists who made this calculation. And your overarching argument is that's not true, right? That if you look at the estimates for how often guns are used for self-defense versus how often they're used for criminal acts, you actually see that guns are used more often in the United States for self-defense than they are for criminal acts. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I feel like it's sort of the key linchpin that holds together a lot of what this book is arguing. Yeah,
basically it's like, it's a net good. And so what I do is I go through and because they always like to cherry pick stats out of context and throw them at us. What I try to do is I try to look at the whole picture. They say, okay, we have X number of murders. We have X number of suicides. We have X number of gun crimes. Therefore, guns are bad. It's like, wait a second, though, but what you just had half the equation here. What about defensive gun uses? And so I cite a whole bunch of different works. And I found about 14 different studies that tried to estimate how often guns are used in self-defense. And the problem with estimating this is the vast majority of the time there's no shots fired. But, there's been a lot of good work done on this. I cite John Lott extensively in this chapter because he's done a lot of work on this. He's an economist. I'm sure most of your regular viewers know him.
Yeah.
But I go through and I compare these things. And when you actually make it an apples and apples comparison, defensive gun use is a huge net win. So even if you take the lowest possible estimated numbers from the people who absolutely hate guns, they want guns off the street, and they will lie, cheat, and steal to accomplish their goals. They say, there's this many defensive gun uses. Well, murders are still down here. Gun crimes, shootings, still down here. So, but then if you take the other studies, like the more honest studies, the regular studies, and you average them out, the actual number is orders of magnitude greater. Because basically in our giant, vast, diverse country, we'll get 250 million people spread out over or 1/3 of a billion people spread out over thousands of miles. Every single day in America, there are events where bad people try to do something and a good guy with a gun stops them. And most of the time, no shots are fired. And in the book, I cite some personal incidences I've had in my life and an event that happened to my wife. Neither one is a thing that shows up as the shooting, because we didn't shoot anybody. Just having the gun, producing the gun was enough to stop the situation, because the bad guy said, I don't want to get shot. I'm going to go elsewhere. And so, I crunched the numbers on this. I'd say probably the two. I used to be a military contractor, but I was an accountant. I was a military contract accountant. So I'm a writer, but I don't shy away from numbers and stats. I enjoy that stuff. I love that stuff. I find it fascinating. I go into a lot of the stats they use. I show where they come from and how they've been twisted. I go into a lot of the common statistical myths they have. One section I really like is where they go through and they talk about America as a country with a gun problem. It's always the gun problem. And they'll compare America to all these other countries. Mm-hmm. But if you actually delve into it and you look at the countries that they compare America to, they almost always compare us to something that's not in any way, shape, or form the same. It's like, okay, you have more gun crime per capita than Denmark. Okay, Denmark is a perfectly homogeneous Nordic nation that has the population of Los Angeles County. Right. But they don't compare America to any cultural or historical analogs. And then when they do, they only go guns, but they always leave out violence. So I look at England, I look at Australia, and so we have less shootings, but then let's get into murders, stabbings, rape, assault, property crime. And all of a sudden the story changes. And then on the shootings thing, it's actually interesting. Well, another thing I discovered is on the stats that other countries lie their butts off. Because I'm going through these stats from various countries about how violent they are. And they always like to say this, well, America is the 79th most dangerous country in America. And 79th most dangerous country in the world. But then you start looking at some of the countries that are ahead of us as being safer. And Sierra Leone is safer than us. Honduras is safer than us. And I'm like, I'm a little suspicious of some of these numbers. And then it's got stuff like China. The giant nation of China with 1 billion people has no murders. No one ever gets murdered in China. It was fascinating to look at the numbers. Like, China, the whole entire nation of China, it's such a peaceful place that no one ever gets killed there. And so
international statistics are always always going to be pretty questionable to some degree, right? Even among peer nations, right? Yep. High income nations, you can still get wildly different ways of measuring. And then you talk about this in the book, to your credit. There's wildly different ways of measuring each one of these kinds of crimes. And so it does make it fairly difficult to compare. But I think that at the end of the day, there is...
Like some of them, it's like, well, we didn't convict anybody, so it doesn't count. Mm-hmm. Well, right. Somebody still got murdered. Yeah, but we didn't arrest anybody, so it's not a stat. Well, wait a minute.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I think even with all that mess, it's still clear, there's sort of this, oftentimes in the gun debate, you get these very stark claims about, more guns equals more crime. And, if that were true, the United States would be by far the most violent nation in the entire world, because we have far more firearms than anyone else by a long stretch. It's not like... Oh, yeah. Close. The American public has more guns than the world's militaries combined.
I've done my part.
Right. So I think that's a very valid point there on looking at these statistics, and the book goes into a lot of this in more detail too. Obviously, you're not going to solve everything or settle every debate through this sort of stuff, but I think that your book makes the best argument. Articulates some of these best arguments out there for the gun rights movement. Like, there's a lot of the best arguments that I've heard over the years as somebody who covers this, and a lot of the arguments I've made myself are in the book. Like, it really is a pretty great primer for this whole debate from the pro-gun point of view. Like, and then even beyond that too, just to get into some of because it's not just you go through. A big chunk of the book is about like the do somethings and what the responses to them are, and the positive case for gun ownership and why it's a good thing and not a negative thing overall. And but then you get into also some of the advice for for new gun owners or people who are looking to get into more gun activism, perhaps. And you talk in a way that really your firearms safety trainer really comes through, I think.
Yeah, I couldn't help but do that.
And which is a good thing, because again, there's so much out there, even in the gun, the gun tuber world or the gunosphere, whatever you want to call it, like gun media, that's not very well informed.
Yeah, there's a lot of bad advice out
like
there,
this,
unfortunately.
and it's actually pretty good.
One of the things I actually was a chapter that I think was really important is I went through and I had a section on use of force and when it's legal to shoot people and how that works. And honestly, that was one. It was based on an article that I did several years ago. It was an aftermath of some shooting where the police had shot somebody. And there's a lot of confusion out there because people see a shooting and they'll have a knee-jerk visceral reaction on whether that was justified or not. Whereas the gun guys, regardless of whether it was good or bad, I'm leaving good or bad aside. I'm just talking legal.
Right.
We would watch it and go, that guy's going to get off. That guy's going to be acquitted. That's unless the jury is nuts. That according to the laws, that guy's getting off. And people will get mad at us. And they'll be like, how dare you? It's like, no, I'm not making any value judgment on anybody involved here. I'm just telling you how the laws work. And so I put my
you went through and
hat
described
on for that one.
Yeah, and I thought you did a great job with it as well. Obviously you make it clear you're not giving legal advice, and the states have differing laws on this, and sometimes a very famous event can happen in a state that has a pretty unique law, like it was in Missouri, I believe it was, with the couple that the BLM protests came by, and they were, and Missouri happens to have a very, very broad protections for defending your property that aren't really applicable in the vast majority of other states. And so it's sort of you have to know every law, you got to understand for yourself what your local and state laws are where you are. But this does give a really good primer of like use of force rules, which are fairly universal, with some small distinctions here and there. And also, I thought it gave not just like, here's, how when you can legally shoot somebody, but it also does talk a little. There was you had three factors, right? The legal use of force is only one of those three. Yeah, legal, moral, and tactical, and so that's important distinction. It's an important reality too, because a lot of people look at I do the Active Self-Protection podcast, and that whole channel is about analyzing self-defense encounters and talking through, mostly it's the tactical side of it, right? How this encounter went, what we can learn from it in case we're ever in an encounter like that. But they also talk about the legal and the moral, because a lot of people, you get caught up on just the legal side of it. And there's other factors to consider, especially if you're ever going to be in a situation like that, which, as you say in the book, hopefully you never are. Yeah,
I actually plug Active Self-Protection in the book too, because I think they're such a great resource. It's such a treasure trove of videos because there's so many misconceptions out there in the world about how violence actually works and how shootings work and how all this stuff unfolds. I think when people actually watch security camera videos of stuff, it changes a lot of perceptions. There's a lot of misconceptions on both sides. The pro-gun side, there's a lot of misconceptions, and then also on the anti-gun side of how this stuff works. A lot of us on our side, unfortunately, will get an unrealistic view of, if this happens, I'll just do this and this. Well,
I'll just pull my gun and they'll run away. That's all.
I'll just pump my shotgun and they'll get scared and run away. It's like, well, what if they don't?
Not always. Yeah, not always.
Yeah, it's not.
You don't want to, or like even sort of oh gosh, I wish I could defend. Yeah, I wish I was in the situation to become a hero or something. And it's like, you probably don't in real life. You probably don't. That's one of the things that's one of the things I learned from, listening to the episodes of Active Self-Protection where people describe being in these circumstances. And even when they're the winner and they did the moral thing, like it's not fun. It's not a good thing. Yeah. You don't feel it like a great,
and depending on where it is, it could very well be
experience.
A very lengthy and expensive legal process afterwards, depending on the situation. I mean, sometimes not, sometimes it is. It's one of those.
Yeah, it totally depends.
Yeah.
And you can't know going into it either.
Yeah, you don't know the character. I mean, like I talked in the book, I talked a little about the Rittenhouse trial, just because that was such a big, pivotal one that so many eyes were on. Because at some point, that kid kind of became the avatar for every person that's ever thought, I'm going to have to shoot bad people doing bad things, and then he got rung through a ringer by a rather incompetent prosecution. But it was an absurd process. But I mean, you look at that, and this fact this guy spent a year, and that was rush. I mean, otherwise, a lot of these can go on for a very long time. So I think it's funny in a book. I have some of my detractors like, "Whoa, Larry's just a bloodthirsty gun nut who wants people to get shot in the streets." Anybody who's read the book knows I spend a good portion of the book talking about why you should avoid shooting people whenever humanly possible.
Yep.
And it's the only, I mean, you shoot people when that's the only choice or the last best choice you have.
Right.
I spend most of the book talking about deterrence and avoidance rather than actively shooting people. But I mean, if you have to shoot people, by golly, you better be good at it, and know what you're doing. And I try to hit all these points. So I'm actually the opposite of bloodthirsty. Everything I'm writing about is I'm trying to the whole purpose of this for me is I'm trying to keep people safer. I don't want people to get hurt. I want people to be able to protect themselves from bad actors. So yeah, it's not oftentimes like I got a deluge of 1-star reviews from people before the book ever came out on places like Goodreads, with people describing what the book is in. And I was like, well, that's fascinating that you're telling me what's in the book, and the only people who've seen it so far are me and the editor.
Of course.
A lot of
stuff. Well, you've had to deal with that your entire career now.
Oh gosh,
that sort of backlash.
Yeah, that's pretty much. I am a openly outspoken registered Republican. I'm pretty conservative. I'm kind of libertarian on a lot of things, but I am that in an industry that is overwhelmingly 99.9% left and is based almost entirely out of Manhattan. So
yeah, and I'll be honest too. I before I'd read the books or I knew who you were, but didn't know a ton about your background. And so I was, when the book agent reached out to see if I'd be willing to have you on the show, I was like, all right, cool. I should read his books and I should look into him. And then there's, he's been protested at this convention or whatever. And I tried to look into like, okay, is there something here? Like, what is it that these people are upset about? Why is he supposed to be such a bad guy? And it was definitely one of those situations where there was a lot of talk about how you're a really bad guy, but not any real examples of things that you had said or done that actually make you like a bad person. And you see this happen, frankly, too often. There are people who are bad, nasty people that I wouldn't want to have on my show, who say racist stuff or do bad things. But usually if that's the case, there's actual examples of it where there's this other phenomenon that happens where people don't like you because you have, how you hold certain beliefs that are more mainstream, that are like pretty straightforward conservative pro-gun beliefs. And so they don't like that. And then they try to pretend that you're this other kind of person who's untouchable.
We have a running
it seems
joke.
Like that's happened a lot with you.
Yes, we have a running joke for about the last 10 years, me and my fan. There's Larry and there's Straw Larry. Now, Straw Larry is the worst guy ever. This guy is a monster. Regular Larry's pretty boring. I'm just kind of normal. But it's kind of a running joke. My ultimate sin is I got famous writing books while not having the right politics. And it's funny because my politics are basically half of America. I'm not an oddity. I don't hold any like bizarre beliefs. I'm a pretty normal guy, honestly, by most of America's standards. If I'm in Texas or Florida or Oklahoma, I'm a normal dude. My problem is I'm in an industry that's in Manhattan and Berkeley and where I'm the one wild red state Republican they keep in a cage and they poke sticks through to see if I'll react.
Right.
But
because I read the book, right, and I got to this section that we're talking about here about, use of force. And if you were, there's people who play that character out there of just like, if it's legal to shoot them, you should just shoot them and be glad that you got the opportunity or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's not at all your perspective on this. The firearms instructor in you definitely comes out in this part of the book where you're describing like, it may be legal for you to do this. And I might be out there advocating that, that we have these legal protections, but It doesn't mean that you should do it. You should always try to avoid, whenever possible, getting into deadly force confrontations. Because even, maybe it works out well for you too. Like there's also just a sort of strategic idea to it. Don't go stupid places with stupid people at stupid times.
John Farnham's rules.
That's very much your ethos that comes through in here. It's not like, go find an excuse to be able to legally shoot people. That's not at all what this book is saying.
No, the opposite. There's a lot of chest beaters out there where it's like the kill them all, let God sort them out kind of thing. It's like, no, that's not realistic. And I get these people who are very cocky and like, well, I'm just going to shoot him because he's a bad guy and he stole from me. He stole my TV. Okay, dude. Unless that TV's made of solid gold, you're going to spend way more time in court on lawyers than your TV is worth. And so if you can just like solve the situation, I mean, and don't get me wrong, I'm condensing a lot of stuff down here. Yeah. If the bad guy has entered your home and is demonstrating that he is a threat to you and others, and he's got the ability and an opportunity to hurt you, and he's acting like he's going to hurt you, shoot him. By all means, shoot that guy. He needs shooting right now. Do it. And make sure you know how to do it accurately and fast. Mm-hmm. So when I say avoidance, but it's just, we get a lot of people out there get a lot of weird, and it's funny because it's not just, it's both sides. Because on one side, we get people on our side who get a little gung-ho. Well, I can't blame them because, it's like we're heading back into the 1970s with the societal decay and the crime and criminals getting let out for free. When the movie Death Wish kind of captured the cultural zeitgeist of people just being sick and tired of this. I get it. I understand. But on this other side, we have on the other side, where I talk about in the book about this, but we have guys like Joe Biden at a Martin Luther King Day event just a couple weeks ago, talking about how he's going to, your AR-15 is useless against the government because we have F-15s.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, first off, the tone deafness of this is, Martin Luther King is a guy who had his Second Amendment rights denied by the government. The government said no, he wanted a concealed weapons permit. They said, no, you can't have one. And so that's ironic. And then the other part of this is a guy who fought for peaceful resolutions to problems in society. And so you're going to go on a memorial event and say, to solve to unpeacefully solve the problems of society, I'm going to kill you with fighter jets. And it's madness.
There is a section in the book that deals with this exact topic, right? This sort of argument. You also point out that Eric Swalwell, the congressman from California, Democrat, he had talked along the same lines. It's one of these common refrains that you get to sort of the core philosophical idea of the Second Amendment, which is that you can an armed populace is hard to oppress, and that you could throw off a tyrant with an armed populace. That's the core of what the Second Amendment is about. Certainly, you talk about that in the book, but the common retort to this is the government's too powerful now. Mm-hmm. It would just nuke you or use F-15s, as the president says. And it always strikes me as such a disturbing and odd, argument to make for exactly the reasons you outline in the book, which is like, you're saying that you're saying that the government would use nukes or fighter jets or whatever against American citizens if, and this is like a positive argument that you're making.
Yeah.
Would you want to live under a government that does that?
Well, that's supposed to make me want to give them my guns.
Right. And it's sort of this, it's also like a wildly fatalistic view too. Like, if tyranny is going to happen, there's nothing you can do about it anyway, and you shouldn't even bother trying.
Well, and it's a really,
sort of the other hand,
logistically and historically speaking, a really dumb idea. And for that chapter, I put my military contractor hat back on, because it's like one of the things that I used to work on was maintaining some of the contracts I was on over the years was maintaining those various advanced weapon systems and keeping the wings from falling off of them. And I go into like, who do you think flies these things? Who do you think uses them? And also the only thing separating them from the people you expect to bomb with them is a chain link fence. Literally in some cases. And so there's a very flippant thing that like a lot of people on the other side think they can throw that out there like it's a threat. That it's just magic. Like, I have nukes, so I win. No, you if you nuke me, your voters live within the blast radius. I don't think there's not really and for historical examples, I go into Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, the beginning of the Ukraine war.
Yeah.
It's just basically what they're advocating for is insane and ridiculous. But I do get into the real meaning of the Second Amendment. It's there for this reason. It's the big red button is what I call it in the book and on the Constitution. It's the thing. It's the switch we don't want to flip, but we need it. We have to have that insurance policy. Otherwise, because if the American government ever goes full 100% boot on your neck tyrant, God help us all, because it is truly a very powerful force.
And the other thing I liked about that passage of the book too is that you weren't saying that we're there, right? Because a lot of times you'll get rhetoric that, tomorrow is the day we need to throw off the government. Things are too far gone. And it's like, no, that's not what the founders believed. They didn't think every minor obstacle that we run into, we need to immediately overthrow the government in a violent revolution. This, like you described, is a absolute last resort sort of thing.
Yep.
So it's not I lost an election or a judge ruled the wrong way this time. This is something that's way down the line when you have no recourse as a people. You have no effect on your government. You have an actual tyrannical king in the case of the colonists and the American Revolution. That's the sort of time that they're talking about. And it's not tomorrow. It's not. My neighbor said something mean about me, so it's time for me to get my musket, kind of thing. And you're very clear about that in the book as well. So again, it gets you sort of like the real Larry versus straw Larry sort of situation. Yeah,
straw Larry's already out there burning stuff, flipping cars over. No, but it's like I do specifically in the book. I talk about the old thing about the 4 boxes of liberty. The ballot box, soap box, jury box, cartridge box. Use them in that order, right? Mm-hmm. Well, right now, if you look around in the world, and I go into this in the book a lot, especially because I wrote this in the immediate aftermath of the Bruin decision, we're still at the jury box level on this on a lot of issues. And I also try to we got a lot of people on our side who get black pilled doom, like we've already lost, it's hopeless. I don't buy into that, because I started doing this 30 years ago. And when we got into this 30 years ago, we had Bill Clinton, the assault weapons ban. We all thought we were within 5 years of losing our Second Amendment rights forever, totally. We were ostracized. We were seen as weird. Culturally, we had stagnated and become insular. And what do I see now 30 years later? I see 25 states, almost going to be 26 if Florida pulls this off, constitutional carry states. When I was young, it was 1. Shall issue CCW was like 7 or 8 states, and now it's all of them. Well, I mean, obviously we have 7 holdouts that are fighting in court, but once again, we're back in court. The culture is growing. Gun sales are through the roof, because every time there's been a bad thing, like 2020 was shattered gun sale records, because regular people who were on the fence sitters I was talking about all of a sudden looked around and said, oh, wow, I'm on my own. No one's coming to save me. I'm it. And they went to their local store and they're like, give me whatever you got. And it wasn't our people buying these guns in 2020. We already got ours. We don't pay scalpers prices. I don't pay MSRP.
Never pay MSRP.
No one. Who does that? But so looking at this, we are culturally winning. Legally, we are making huge gains. And we have some setbacks. Like right now, we have the ATF brace ban 120 days just kicked in, right? And I have to decide, what am I going to do? I have a stack of these things because, and I'm not alone. And they estimate 40 million of them in circulation. The ATF just said, hey, comply or you're felons. And so that's going to court. I mean, I've already saw this morning, I was looking at the FPC lawsuit that just barely got filed. I don't know any details yet. I know SAF, GOA, ILA, they're all suing too. Mm-hmm. And what's going to happen in the next 120 days? I can't say. I don't know.
They have a pretty good shot, though, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully we continue winning at the court level. But the thing people need to remember is courts take time. And if you look at the bump stock ban, we recently just got a stop on the bump stock ban. And what did that take? 4 years?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, but the real thing is who's going to get victimized and rolled up in federal gun control violations in the meantime. And that's the tragic part.
Yeah, certainly there's plenty of ongoing controversies that still exist. It's not a perfect utopia for gun owners at this point, but yeah, I think it's a very valid point, and you do talk about this in the book as well, that there has been a lot of progress if you're a gun rights advocate over the last 30 years, and there's no reason to think that will stop suddenly now. And you talk about getting people involved. That's sort of the next step after buying guns. You can find ways to get involved in the effort to expand gun rights in America. And there's all sorts of different ways about that. That was another thing I enjoyed about the book is, like, again, this is sort of that there's the stereotype of what people might think of a gun night book is going to be like, and then there's what your book is actually like. And you talk about the grandfather that takes their granddaughter shooting for the first time and helps ingrain that culture into their family members, is doing just as much for improving gun rights in the country as somebody who's knocking on their congressman's door or what have you.
Yep. It's one of those things that, like, honestly, this is a battle of the culture war. And it's become a thing that a lot of people hate guns and hate gun culture just because they're supposed to. It's a religious thing. And how do you overcome that is just teaching people, helping people, help your neighbors, help your friends, teach your kids, teach other people's kids, get them to the range, show them that this stuff is not crazy, wacky, all the stuff you're showing on the news. I like to take, when I built my house where I live now, the very first thing I did before I built the house was build a range. I pushed up berms. And what was the very first thing I did with my new neighbors? I was actually a church youth activity where I put on a little 3-hour pistol clinic for a bunch of the local teenagers.
Nice.
You gotta keep teaching them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And look, I'd love to have you stay on for another hour here, but I know that you're very busy. And so I would thank you for being on and give you an opportunity here to tell people where they can find the latest book and also some of your other work.
Okay, so my book is available. It's In Defense of the Second Amendment. It's available everywhere bookstores. Everywhere in all bookstores. It's Barnes & Noble, Amazon.com. If you like audiobooks, you can get it on Audible from Blackstone. And so check it out. I hope you like it. If you like it, please leave an honest review. And you have any other books coming up? I do, actually. My next book is actually the fourth book in my epic fantasy series called Tower of Silence from Baen Books. That'll be out in April. That's kind of a really cool fantasy world with a kind of mythological India. It's pretty badass. Nice. I imagine there's gun stuff in there too, maybe? Matchlocks, actually. They're at the early muzzleloader level of firearms in this setting. That's pretty cool. And knowing how your other books have gone, I imagine the detail in there will also be very engaging on the firearms front. So it is actually pretty fun to write an epic fantasy with black powder. It's pretty cool. All right, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and hopefully we can have you back on again in the future as well. Oh, I appreciate it. Thanks, Stephen.
All right, it's time for the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman, joined, of course, by Reload founder Steve Gutowski. How are you this week? I'm doing great, Jake. I see the shirt. Eagles are going to the Super Bowl. Yes, there's the shirt. No one likes us. We don't care. But I'm pretty good mood. We got 1 week left here. I think we'll have one more podcast that we film before the Super Bowl actually happens. But only the members will actually have listened to it by the time, because it'll come out on Sunday, on Super Bowl Sunday. And pretty great. If anyone has free tickets to the Super Bowl that are just lying around that they want to get rid of, I will take them. I don't know how much of a chance there is for that, but I'm down. Very, very good week leading up to this. Enjoying the NFC Championship win and looking forward to the next Super Bowl here with the MVP of the league at quarterback and an unstoppable pass rush and
I'm pretty excited about it. Patrick Mahomes is something else, something totally unique. So obviously worried about him, but I'm pretty confident in how the Eagles are shaping up, and hoping to climb some poles next
There you go.
Sunday here.
Yeah. We'll see you out in a mob of people out on Broad Street.
I mean, yeah, if we win, I'll be there.
Yeah.
I promise. I was there last time. I climbed up Broad and Pine, the light pole there. I hurt myself a little bit, but it was worth it.
That's right.
Definitely worth it.
For the birds.
Yeah, go Birds.
Right. But anyways, getting to the news this week, we have a pretty big ruling out of the Fifth Circuit. This one's, I think, going to be pretty controversial for the foreseeable future because the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals just struck down the federal prohibition on people subject to domestic violence restraining orders from being prohibited from owning guns. If you want to tell us a little bit about what went into that decision.
Yeah, so there was a 3-judge panel in the Fifth Circuit that ruled unanimously against this federal law that bars people under a domestic violence restraining order from possessing firearms. And they found that it was unconstitutional under the Bruin standard. They said that the government didn't provide any historical analogs that were similar enough to the modern prohibition that they could stand under the Second Amendment. So this is obviously a fairly significant ruling. It's the first time we've seen an appellate court rule on this prohibition since the Bruin case happened. And I think it's going to have some it's going to lead very quickly, I think, to Supreme Court review. That's my guess. It's sort of fast track now for the Supreme Court to take up because it's very likely that the government will appeal this decision, similar to when we talked about the bump stock ban being overturned in the Fifth Circuit as well. That the bump stock ban ruling was an en banc ruling. It was the full Fifth Circuit court. This is just a 3-judge panel. You still have the option of going to the full Fifth Circuit court to hear this case on appeal, or you go straight to the Supreme Court, I believe, if the government wants to. It's obviously one of the thornier questions, I think, that has been raised thus far. Gun rights groups were not involved in this case. Neither were the gun control groups. This was a criminal case where somebody who was charged and actually convicted of violating this law appealed that conviction under the Bruin standard, and this was the result of that appeal. There was actually the Fifth Circuit reversing themselves. They had previously upheld this prohibition under the older standard of review that had become popular between Heller and Bruin, where you had this sort of 2-step balancing test, and the Fifth Circuit had upheld the domestic violence restraining order prohibition under that test previously, but now they've correctly determined that they can't use balancing anymore. They can't balance the interests of public safety against the Second Amendment right. So now they have to use this history and tradition standard to evaluate these sorts of cases. And at least according to this Fifth Circuit panel, that prohibition doesn't survive.
Yeah, no, and this is just sort of the latest that we've seen, I think, sort of the less appreciated ramification of Bruin. I think most folks would consider. A lot of gun control or gun rights advocates obviously thought of policies like assault weapons bans and concealed carry bans were going to be the things that were going to be overturned after Bruin came down. But, shortly after that decision handed down, I wrote a members piece talking about how, criminal justice advocates and federal public defenders were starting to use this law to overturn convictions. And it's just gone crazy, I think, in the time since that's come down. And this is just the latest example of that.
Yeah, there's been a lot of crazy in the sense that it's been very busy. Yeah,
right.
There's been a lot of these decisions out of the criminal side of things, which makes sense, right? I mean, obviously the gun rights groups have their strategic plans that they're going after certain laws that they find highly objectionable, and they're pursuing those cases. But at the same time, you have the entire criminal justice system that is where these defendants and their lawyers are acting independently, using the same standard. And so, we get focused on a lot, I think, in political media on the first part of it, right, on these sort of organized efforts to go after different gun restrictions. But there's sort of this it's much harder to follow the other stuff because it's all individuals. And so a lot of times you don't hear about it until a ruling gets handed down like this, and it can be a very impactful ruling. I think this is probably going to be a case where the court is the outcome is much less certain if it is to reach the Supreme Court. Now, first, I said this is a fast track, probably, right? Because the court oftentimes will take up appeals by the government when it deals with federal law like this, because you don't necessarily want a situation where federal law only applies in certain parts of the country, right? And so that's what's happening right now with this Fifth Circuit ruling. In the Fifth Circuit, which covers Texas and Louisiana, the federal government can't practically apply this prohibition, but they can in every other circuit right now, because nowhere else has seen this sort of ruling yet. So oftentimes, though, the Supreme Court has a lot of deference to the government in taking up these sorts of appeals. That's why I think it could happen quickly. However, it is also possible that because there isn't actually a circuit split yet under the Bruin standard, there's a circuit split in the sense that the Fifth Circuit now has a different position on this prohibition than every other circuit, but that's only because every other circuit hasn't heard a case like this under the Bruin standard. And so the court may want to wait for the other circuits to weigh in first and see how they handle this question, because it is going to be an interesting question. I think the history analysis in this case was closer than in a lot of other cases that you've seen. A lot of the federal judges that have upheld various gun restrictions to this point have done so less on the actual finding of a solid historical analog and more on, the argument that some part of the what's being foreclosed by the law is just not protected by the Second Amendment. You see this Oregon, even though the state court there blocked the new gun control law that was passed by ballot initiative, the federal judge was prepared to let that go into effect, in essence, because she ruled that for instance, the magazine ban that they're putting in place, she ruled that magazines aren't protected by the core of the Second Amendment, like they're not arms. It was one of her reasonings, and so that's been a common way of trying to uphold these various gun laws under Bruin. But in this case, they went through the historical analysis and they determined a couple interesting things, and I think that they were much closer to finding a historical analog than in a lot of other cases. First off, they looked at a couple of things. The government offered up a couple different historical gun regulations as potential analogs. There was, dangerous people prohibitions, the sort of stuff we've talked about before on this channel, that include, of course, bigoted laws against African Americans and Native Americans, just sort of total gun bans for them altogether. But also there were bans for people who wouldn't take pledges of allegiance, or people that were, and then they went sort of further back into English history where people could be disarmed if they were thought to be, a danger to the crown or to the people or what have you. And so they started with that. Then there was the prohibitions on going armed to the terror of the people was another one that they cited. And then, of course, they brought up surety laws, which required people who were accused of being dangerous in a civil proceeding to post sort of bond or surety if they wanted to carry their guns in public, to sort of insure against them causing problems was the idea. And those laws were fairly common at the founding era. And of course, the court rejected all of these comparisons, mainly for two reasons. One was they didn't fit the purpose of the domestic violence restraining order prohibition. So the purpose of that is to protect keep somebody who has been identified a potential threat to another individual from causing harm to that person. And that's not what any of these other laws had done, or at least not the dangerousness law, sort of dangerous groups of people. Those were aimed at groups that were considered to be dangerous, whether for bigoted reasons or otherwise. And then to go to the terror of the people, being armed to the terror of the people was something that required a conviction, and also was meant to protect the general peace, not specific people. Again, that was another thing the court pointed out as a difference. And of course, the surety laws were much closer than the other two, according to this Fifth Circuit panel. But even there, the main problem was, even though these were civil proceedings in both situations and not criminal proceedings, they don't require convictions. The surety laws only required that somebody post a bond, basically post a surety to carry their guns in public, whereas the domestic violence restraining order prohibition takes the person's guns away altogether and bans them from possessing them. So there were a lot of closer calls, I think, in this case than in some of the other ones, if that makes sense.
Right. And I think that's going to be interesting if and when the Supreme Court decides to take this issue up, is that I think it'll cause maybe the first real stress test of the new Bruin standard, because as we've seen in previous Supreme Court decisions on the Second Amendment, notably Heller, the dicta that the court has offered up seems to suggest that they just seem to believe automatically that certain dangerous people are allowed to be prohibited from owning guns, but it's never really been put to this Bruin test. And if they decide to take this case, it'll be the first time that they really have to kind of square that circle then to show how this does fit, in fact fit, or maybe the dicta that they previously offered up was wrong. We don't know yet.
Yeah, I think that's the other big point here, which is that the Supreme Court gave down this standard in Bruin that would seem to implicate a lot of laws that the Supreme Court itself has indicated they think are constitutional. For instance, like you mentioned there, bans on machine gun sales or ownership. New sales of machine guns are illegal in the United States now. And that's from a law that was created in 1934. It's not an old law. It doesn't go back to the founding era. And it's unlikely that you could find a historical analog for that law. And yet, the Supreme Court has implied that it's constitutional in Heller, at least in dicta, which means in writings that aren't to the core of the holding. And same thing with felon in possession laws. They've said that those are presumptively constitutional. At least they've said that Heller doesn't implicate them directly. And there's another one where there's at least an argument to be had about what the historical justification for those laws are, which again that comes from the Gun Control Act of 1968, which is again not a historical law. And, there's all sorts of things like that. And same thing, even in Bruin, there was concurrence from Roberts and Kavanaugh that talked about how they shall issue gun carry permits as constitutional, as presumptively constitutional. And there's the same thing there. Like, where's any sort of permitting to carry a gun during the founding era? I don't think that it existed at all. And so you have what the Supreme Court has handed down in their standard in Bruin, and then you have what the Supreme Court seems willing to actually do. And they may be two different things. We don't know. That's the thing about Second Amendment jurisprudence at the Supreme Court. It's very limited, even still. They only had a handful of cases, 4 or 5 cases, really, if you count Miller, which they do use in Heller as a basis. So, that's 4 cases with Saitano, right, that directly deal with the Second Amendment. And, you got Miller, Heller, McDonald, Saitano, and Bruin. So 5. And, how many First Amendment cases are there? There's, dozens and dozens and dozens, hundreds probably. And so there's still a lot to be learned about what this court is going to do with these sort of controversial rulings, these controversial situations, because to this point, as we've talked about before on the show, they've really only gone after things that are really wildly popular. So Heller is about handgun ownership. You can't ban handguns, which is a position that the general public was way ahead of the Supreme Court on. And then Bruin is about how you can't ban gun carry or effectively ban it, which again was something the general public was way ahead of the Supreme Court on, because there were only 8 states that had a ban on, or had like an effective ban. They may issue laws by the time the Supreme Court got around to Bruin. So things like domestic violence, restraining orders leading to prohibition, probably a lot more popular than both of those previous tests, right? Those previous laws. And that's where you start to wonder what the court is actually going to do in that situation. Now, I will say that the lower court in the Fifth Circuit, they seem to have, one of the key issues in this case seemed to be that it was a restraining order that can be granted through civil proceedings and not through criminal convictions, where people are afforded more protections for their rights and the standard of evidence is higher. So maybe the Supreme Court also views that distinction as important in this role. But we'll have to wait and see, at this point. I don't know that we'll have to wait very long, but we will have to wait. So I think that's all we've got for this week. But we appreciate you guys sticking through and listening to the show. And if you want to help us grow, you can like and share on YouTube, on your favorite podcasting app. You can leave us a review. That's always helpful as well. And you can also head over to thereload.com and pick up a membership today if you want to help support us, because that is how we do this whole thing. That is where our revenue comes from, directly from members. We are an independent publication. We're not owned by any billionaires or giant corporations or what have you. We rely on our memberships for funding, for operation. We wouldn't exist at all without our members. And of course, if you are a member, you get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and reporting that you won't find anywhere else. And you'll also get this podcast a day early and the opportunity to appear on the show. We'd love to have another member segment here soon. So if you want to do that, just reply to your Sunday members newsletter and let us know that you want to come on. We'll make it happen. Until then, go Birds, and we will see you next week.